In the fall of 1857, the people of Calpa County, Virginia, saw what would later be called one of the most disturbing manipulations ever caught on tape in quiet voices. In the South before the Civil War, the case of Magnolia Harrington and her boss, Theodore Whitman, would question everything the community thought they knew about power, intelligence, and the dangerous games were played behind closed doors in the big plantation houses that were spread out across the Virginia countryside. Theodore Whitman owned one of the biggest tobacco farms in Culpeper County. It was more than 2,000 acres big, next to the Rappahannock River. His estate, Whitman's Rest, had 43 rooms. Enslaved people who worked the fields and took care of the big Georgian mansion that had been in his family for generations. For 3 generations of family, Theodore was thought to be one of the most eligible widowers in the county. He lost his wife Margaret to consumption 2 years ago. He was alive, alone in the big house with only his servants to keep him company, running his business with the same careful attention to detail that had made his plantation one of the most profitable in the area. One of the enslaved people at Whitman's Rest was a young woman named Magnolia Harrington. She was born on the plantation in 1839 and grew up in the house instead of the fields. Fields, learning to read and write with the Whitman kids before Theodore's father thought it was too much for them. Not appropriate for school. At 18 years old in 1857, Magnolia had become what the county records would later call a woman of rare beauty and intelligence. She mostly worked in the main house, keeping track of the household's finances and serving as Theodore's personal assistant. Secretary, which gave her special access to the master's private affairs and business dealings, business and personal matters. In late 2011, the first signs that something was wrong at Whitman's Rest appeared. In September 1857, a few plantation owners in the area started talking about Theodore's behavior at their weekly meetings at the Culpeper courthouse was getting more and more strange. Before now known. Because of his sharp business sense and conservative nature, Theodore started making strange financial decisions that made his peers scratch their heads. He sold prime farmland for less than the going rate, fired his overseer without giving a reason, and most strangely, he started spending long hours locked in his study, with only Magnolia there to help him with what he said were important legal papers. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's most respected doctor and Theodore's longtime friend, later said that he had gone to Whitman's Rest in early October and found his friend very upset. Theodore talked in a way that didn't make sense about changing his will and making plans for the future that would protect the legacy of his plantation. When Dr. Morrison asked what kind of changes these were, Theodore got defensive and said that Magnolia had told certain things that his late wife wanted that needed to be taken care of right away. The doctor said that. Theodore seemed to be having a lot of trouble sleeping and had developed a nervous tic that made his hands shake uncontrollably. The change in Theodore's behavior happened at the same time as a series of late night things that happened on the plantation that upset both the enslaved people and their neighbors. And estates nearby. Field hands said they heard Theodore, and Magnolia had heated talks that went on for a long time. The early morning hours, when you could hear furniture being moved and papers being shuffled. James Crawford, who took over as overseer, wrote down a number of times where he found Theodore walking around the plantation grounds before dawn, mumbling to himself and carrying what looked like legal papers. When Crawford tried to ask Theodore about these nighttime activities, he told him to leave quickly and warned him not to get involved in things he didn't understand. The situation got to. In the middle of October, things got very bad when Theodore called his lawyer, Cornelius Ashford, to the plantation for a meeting in an emergency. Ashford, who had been in charge of the Whitman family's legal matters for more than 20 years, was shocked by the changes to Theodore's will that were suggested. Ashford later said that Theodore wanted to set up an unprecedented arrangement that would give Magnolia a lot of power over the plantation's operations and give her a lot of money. The lawyer strongly advised against such drastic changes and warned Theodore that the suggested changes would probably run into big legal and social problems. Against. Ashford said that Theodore's response was almost hysterical with the plantation owner, insisting that he had found out something that made him have to act right away. What Ashford didn't do. Learned much later what kind of information had such a big impact on. Changed Theodore's mind through a careful campaign that had. Magnolia had been working to convince her master for months that his late wife Margaret had hidden important proof of who really owns the plantation, using fake letters. Magnolia said that the original land grants had mistakes in them and that Margaret wrote them before she died. That could make Theodore's claim to large parts of his property invalid. The papers that looked like Margaret's handwriting said that only by following certain steps could. Theodore could protect his property by giving instructions on how to treat and free certain enslaved people, family's legacy from possible legal problems. The fake items were made with great skill, adding information about the plantation's past that only someone who knew the family well could have known. Only people who were close to them could have known. Magnolia had been watching for years, studying Margaret's handwriting, learning about the couple's private lives, and looking at how she wrote letters. Conversations that are private. The fake letters talked about conversations and events that only Margaret would have known, which was a psychological trap that took advantage of. The sadness and guilt Theodore felt after his wife's death. Each document added to. The ones before it, making the story more and more complicated and showing that Margaret had found dangerous secrets about the plantation's legal foundation just before her death. The psychological manipulation went beyond the forged documents to include a series of carefully planned events meant to make Theodore's paranoia worse and reliance on Magnolia's advice. She made sure that certain books would go missing from his library and show up in strange places, always with. Through mysterious notes that Margaret is said to have left, things that belonged to. His dead wife started showing up in rooms where there was no reason for her to be. Each discovery happened at the same time as Magnolia's presentation of new evidence regarding the alleged legal threats confronting the plantation. The overall effect of these events made people feel like something supernatural was going on, which made things worse. Theodore's rational thinking made him more open to Magnolia's ideas. As time went on, Theodore's behavior got more and more strange and lonely. He fired most of his house staff, keeping only Magnolia and 2 old servants who had been working on the plantation for decades. His letters to business partners became random and hard to understand, which made some creditors worried about the plantation's ability to stay financially stable. Dr. Morrison tried several times to visit his friend, but Magnolia kept turning him away, saying that Theodore was sick with a nervous condition that needed total rest and being alone. The doctor became even more worried when he heard from other people in the county that they had seen Theodore walking the plantation boundaries at night, apparently looking for the landmarks that were mentioned in the fake documents. The worst of the crisis happened on the night of October 28, 1857. When Theodore finished the last version of his revised will with 2 witnesses present who had been called by Magnolia. Legal experts would later call the document one of the strangest wills ever written in Virginia, gave Magnolia immediate freedom when Theodore died, as well as the right to own 500 acres of prime, a lot of farmland and a lot of money, The will is more important then. Gave her the title of executive of the estate and a lot of power to run the plantation and make decisions about the other slaves. The witnesses were both old. People who lived in Calpa County and had known the Whitman family for decades later said that Theodore looked like. Very upset during the signing ceremony, often. Referring to the wishes of his dead wife and saying that he was fulfilling a sacred duty to protect the family's honor. None of the witnesses knew at the time that the signing ceremony was a sign of the end of a months-long psychological campaign that had systematically ruined Theodore's mental health and ability to make good decisions. Magnolia had read her master's work. Weaknesses with the same level of accuracy as a military strategist taking advantage of his sadness, guilt, and lack of friends to make a perfect storm of weakness. She knew that Theodore's love for his dead wife was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, and his most vulnerable point of weakness, and she used her lies to change that love into a weapon against what he wants. The day after the wills, completion brought about an unexpected turn of events that would change the course of the case forever. Theodore was found in his study by one of the older servants, who was slumped over his desk with what looked like a last letter, sent to his lawyer. The doctor in the area who looked at the body said that death was caused by what he called a heart failure, probably caused by extreme emotional pain and not being able to sleep for a long time. The letter, which was never made public, but was brought up in later court cases, allegedly had Theodore's confession that he had been manipulated, but felt like they couldn't fight the psychological hold that Magnolia had taken control of him. Finding out that Theodore had died set off. His distant cousins, who were set to inherit the will, immediately filed a legal challenge to its validity. Plantation, according to the old version of the document. Their search, done with the help of a private detective from Richmond, revealed how complicated the situation was. Magnolia lied just weeks after Theodore died. Experts in handwriting found that the letters that Margaret Whitman supposedly wrote were well-made forgeries. The plantation's historical records showed that the legal threats mentioned in the documents were made up completely. The investigation also found proof that Magnolia had been stealing small amounts of money from the household accounts on a regular basis for a number of years, using the money to buy the supplies she needed to make fake documents. The legal actions that came after Theodore's death showed the full extent of Magnolia's manipulation and brought up troubling questions about the psychological weaknesses that had let her lie. Plantation workers said that she had spent months watching Theodore's habits and feelings, patterns, carefully timing her revelations to coincide with times when he was most open to being told what to do. The fake letters had been sent out over the course of a few months, each one adding to Theodore's growing paranoia and reliance on Magnolia's explanations of what they mean. Witnesses who are experts said that the psychological manipulation was one of the most advanced confidence schemes ever written down in the area, even though there is a lot of proof of fraud and the legal challenge to Theodore's will faced significant manipulation. Difficulties because of Virginia's complicated racial and social dynamics before the Civil War. Society. The court had a hard time dealing with a case where a slave had successfully tricked a white plantation owner, which went against basic ideas about how things work. The essence of slavery and racial stratification. Some legal experts said that acknowledging Magnolia's intelligence and strategic thinking would weaken the ideological underpinnings that justified the very existence of slavery. Some people said that Theodore's. It was impossible to figure out what he really wanted when he made the will because of his mental state at the time, the things that had an effect on his choice. In the spring of 1858, the case was settled when A., The two sides that were fighting came to an agreement. The courts said that Theodore's last will was not valid because there was proof of fraud and undue influence. However, they did say that the earlier version of the document had provisions for Magnolia's influence, but admitted that the earlier version of the document had rules for Magnolia's freedom that seemed to show Theodore's true intentions. She was given her freedom and a small amount of money, but she had to leave Virginia for good and give up any claim to the plantation or its assets. The deal made everyone happy, none of the parties involved, but it was the only politically acceptable way to settle a case that had revealed unpleasant realities regarding intelligence, manipulation, and authority in the South before the Civil War. In June 1858, Magnolia left Virginia, which ended her direct involvement in the case, but there are still questions about what will happen to her in the end and the larger. People were still interested in what her actions meant for years to come. Some reports said that she had gone north to Pennsylvania, where she made a new life for herself and She used her education and smarts to make a good life for herself as a free woman. Some people said that she had just vanished into the complicated web of free black communities that existed along the borders between the North and South. What was still clear was that her manipulation of Theodore Whitman had shown intellectual abilities that went against what most people thought. Assumptions about what it means to be a slave and the people who lived as slaves. The Whitman. The plantation itself never fully got over the scandal and the mental trauma that came with it. Trauma that came with the case. The cousins of Theodore, who, eventually, inherited the property and had a hard time keeping it profitable in the face of ongoing rumors and gossip about the strange things that had happened there. After reporting strange noises and disturbances in the main house, a number of overseers quit their jobs. House, which led to rumors that the plantation was cursed or haunted by the unresolved issues surrounding Theodore's death. In the end, the property was sold in 1862. Pay off debts, and the big house was torn down in 1868, after being badly damaged in the Civil War. The larger effects of Magnolia's lie extended far beyond the people who were there at the time and continued to affect conversations about slavery, intelligence, and psychological manipulation until the Civil War started. Abolitionists took advantage of the case as proof that enslaved people were smart, which went against the racist idea that they were not. Reasons for their slavery. People who were against slavery said that this incident showed how dangerous it is to let enslaved people access to schooling and trusted roles in plantation homes. This case became a touchstone for discussions about what intelligence is and how social factors affect it. Circumstances could either limit or free up a person's potential. In the year 1863, 5 years after Magnolia left Virginia, a graduate student at the University of Virginia tried to conduct a thorough examination of the case as a component of his thesis on psychological manipulation and social control in the antebellum South. His research, which included talking to surviving participants and looking at legal documents, found more details about how advanced Magnolia's business was that had not been. Came out during the first legal proceedings. The student found proof that she had been secretly writing to educated free blacks in Richmond and Washington, which suggests that the plan may have been part of a larger network of resistance activities instead of just one person's attempt to make sure she is free. The researcher vanished, so the thesis was never finished. During a trip to talk to former plantation workers in the spring of 1864, people found his notes, which were in his dormitory room several weeks later, had bits and pieces of information about other cases of psychological manipulation of enslaved individuals across the the countryside of Virginia. The university administration said the research project was over and put the materials where they stayed until a fire destroyed a lot of the historical 1,897 collection. Because these papers were lost, a lot of questions would never be answered. There would never be a clear answer to the question of what the case of Magnolia meant for the bigger picture. The passage of time has only added to the mystery of how smart Magnolia really is and what she really wants. The effects of her manipulation of Theodore Whitman. Historians of today who have examined the incomplete records that remain from the case have remarked on the advanced comprehension of human psychology that her scheme showed, hinting at abilities that went beyond what most people living in slavery today thought was possible. The accuracy with which she took advantage of Theodore's emotional weaknesses and the months of careful planning it took to carry out her deception demonstrates a degree of strategic thinking that contests simplistic assumptions regarding intellectual development within the constraints of slavery. Assumptions regarding the intellectual advancement feasible within the limitations of slavery. The most disturbing part of Magnolia's story might not be the manipulation itself, but the questions it asks about how many other cases like this one may have happened without, that were never found or written down. The South before the Civil War was built on a complicated web of personal relationships and psychological dependencies that made many chances for subtle manipulation and coercion, the seclusion of plantation existence amalgamated, with the strong emotional ups and downs that come with being a master and a slave, made it easy for Magnolia to do the kind of psychological warfare that was so effective for her. Effectively. The possibility that her case was not an isolated incident, but merely the most visible. An example of a widespread phenomenon adds a very disturbing layer to our comprehension of slavery's psychological effects on both the enslaved and making people slaves. The surviving records from the Theodore Whitman case remain intriguing. Scholars and legal historians who examine the intricate interplay of authority and resistance in the South before the Civil War, the complexity of Magnolia's psychological manipulation, along with her apparent ability to keep her lie going for months without anyone noticing, suggests that she is smart. The institution systematically denied and suppressed capabilities of being a slave. She was able to change Theodore's love for his dead wife into something else. Against his own interests shows a deep understanding of human nature that calls into question easy ideas about how education, intelligence, and the state of society. But there are still questions about what Magnolia's success will cost her and, for the larger community that was affected by what she did, the psychological harm done to. Theodore Whitman's injuries were bad enough to kill him, and the legal and social chaos that followed her death. Exposure changed the lives of dozens of other enslaved people who had no taking part in her plan. The case serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression, no matter how smart it is, usually comes with a cost. That goes far beyond the people who are directly involved. The moral intricacy of it is hard to put Magnolia's actions into a simple category of heroic or not, resistance or criminal manipulation, instead taking up an uncomfortable middle ground that shows the impossible choices that people who are enslaved have to make. The most interesting part of the case that is still going on is what will happen to Magnolia Harrington in the end. Create speculation and debate more than 150 years after her, missing from the historical record. Some researchers think she might have been one of the educated African Americans who played important roles in the Underground Railroad in the years leading up to the Civil War, using her proven skills in psychological manipulation and forgery to help other enslaved people get away. Some people have said that she just moved into one of the already established free black communities in the North, where her smarts and education would have helped her start a new life far away from the traumatic. The things that happened to her when she was a child, the lack of clear information. The unsettling quality of Magnolia's story is made worse by what we learn about her later life. Readers are left to wonder if justice was served in the end, or if a brilliant, but a morally complicated person just disappeared into the shadows of history. The case of Theodore Whitman, and the woman who ruined him by carefully using his deepest emotions. Emotions continue to serve as evidence of the covert psychological warfare that characterized a lot of relationships in the system of slavery. It reminds us that intelligence and strategic thinking can come from anywhere, under the most oppressive circumstances, often in ways that call into question the basic ideas that the situation was based on. And maybe that's the most upsetting truth this long-lost chapter of Virginia history shows. In a world built on the systematic, denying human dignity and intelligence, Magnolia Harrington demonstrated that the human mind could not be entirely subjugated, even when it was, owned by someone else legally. Her victory was not complete and came at a huge cost. But it showed things that the people who supported slavery didn't want to see, and that even its opponents had a hard time fully understanding. The sound of her soft footsteps moving through the halls of Whitman's Rest in the last few months before Theodore died is something that no amount of legal paperwork or social control can stop, could not completely silence. The constant whisper of human intelligence saying no, to be put out no matter what tried to keep it going. The effects of Magnolia's manipulation lasted even after the Civil War in ways that not many people could have predicted right after Theodore died. In 1869, a set of documents came to light almost 11 years after she left Virginia, in a Philadelphia law office that showed how smart she was. Original Plan. The papers found during the settlement of an unrelated estate included what looked like detailed notes written in Magnolia's. There were what looked like detailed notes written in Magnolia's estate. Distinctive handwriting that shows how she used psychological manipulation on Theodore and her study of other people who are vulnerable in the same way. Plantation owners all over the Culpa County area. The paper said that Magnolia had been doing what was basically a systematic study of the psychological vulnerabilities displayed by slaveholders, documenting their anxieties, guilt, and emotional dependencies with the clinical precision of a trained doctor. Her notes included details about certain conversations, behaviors, and family histories that she had put together over the years by watching people closely and asking the right questions. What bothered me the most was that she seemed to be able to tell who would be most likely to be manipulated because of their ties to the dead, family members, their worries about money, and their social insecurities in the plantation hierarchy. Dr. Jonathan Matthews is a doctor in Philadelphia and an amateur psychologist who looked at the papers in 1870 and said they were one of the most advanced examinations of human conduct he had encountered beyond, in formal academic settings. The notes showed not only how smart Magnolia was, but also how she thought about and used things. Intelligence, as well as her methodical way of learning about and using the psychological forces that controlled her world. Matthews thought that her. The success with Theodore Whitman may have been the result of years of practice and improvement, not just one clever lie. Finding these papers led to renewed. Researchers looking into the psychological aspects of slavery and resistance are now more interested in the original case. The Virginia Historical Society hired a private investigator to try to find out where Magnolia went after her, leaving the state, finding bits and pieces of proof that she had gone north, but had kept in touch with an underground group of educated former slaves throughout the 1860s. Several people said they saw a woman who looked like her in different cities between Philadelphia and Boston, always with people who are known to be helping newly freed slaves. More interestingly, the investigator found references to a number of unexplained financial problems that had affected a number of important families all over Virginia in the years leading up to the Civil War. In each case, rich plantation. After long periods of time, owners often made sudden and dramatic changes to their wills or financial plans. What family members said was strange anxiety and behavior that was kept secret. Even though there was no direct link to Magnolia, the pattern was very similar to the mind games she had played with Theodore Whitman. The investigation was suddenly stopped in 1871 when the detective who was hired to do the research was found dead in his hotel room in Richmond under circumstances that the police called suspicious. Room in Richmond in a way that the police said was suspicious, but not clear. His notes, which he had kept very well during his investigation, vanished from his room before the police could get to them. The Virginia Historical Society made it official, closed the investigation because they were worried about the safety of more researchers and the sensitive nature of the historical questions that are being looked into. In 1873, 15 years after Theodore Whitman's death, something amazing happened that brought back interest in the psychological aspects of the original case. A young woman saying who she is, as Sarah Washington got closer to Cornelius Ashford's law office in Richmond, saying they know where Magnolia Harrington is and what she's been doing since she left Virginia. Sarah, who looked to be in her early 20s and spoke with the refined accent of an educated Northern woman, showed documents that she said. An educated Northern woman spoke with an accent and showed papers that she said. Showed that Magnolia had started a successful business in Philadelphia that offered legal and financial advice, help for slaves who had just been freed. If the documents are real, they showed that. Magnolia had used her smarts and knowledge of how to manipulate the law to helped dozens of former slaves deal with the difficult bureaucratic problems of making new lives in the North. Sarah said that Magnolia came up with new ways to help former slaves prove who they are, find family members who are separated, and find jobs that fit their skills and education levels. Members and get job offers that match their skills and education levels. The consulting. Reports say that the business had become very successful, which helped Magnolia build up a lot of wealth while keeping a low profile that kept her safe from possible legal problems from her past. Cornelius Ashford, who had been haunted by his part in the Theodore Whitman case for more than 10 years, agreed to meet with Sarah, too. Look more closely at her papers. She told him about the psychological manipulation techniques that Magnolia had used against Theodore during their meeting. The ways that Magnolia had used to control Theodore, information that she said she got from talking directly to the woman. Most surprising. Sarah said that Magnolia didn't see her manipulation of Theodore as an isolated incident, but as a test. Case for ways that could help other enslaved people get their freedom through mental, instead of fighting back physically. The meeting with Sarah Washington turned out to be the last written communication between any representative of Magnolia Harrington and the Virginia legal community. Ashford's notes from the meeting were found among his papers after he died. Sarah had promised to set up a meeting with the lawyer directly before her death in 1886, between Magnolia and the lawyer. But this meeting never happened. After that, there were more attempts to find Sarah or check the validity of her papers. Didn't work, which led some researchers to think that the whole thing was a The incident may have been another elaborate trick to see how much interest there is in Magnolia's case. Interest in Magnolia's case. The question of whether Sarah Washington was a real person acting on Magnolia's behalf, or just another way for her to keep controlling her. Behalf, or just another sign that she was still being manipulated from a distance is still not clear to this day. The sophisticated nature of the information she gave and her close knowledge of details that had never been made public suggest that she had kept in touch with Magnolia, or that she might have been Magnolia herself, using a fake name, when the meeting took place. Happening 15 years after the first case, and at the same time as a new interest in the psychological aspects of slavery. It may not have been a coincidence that people were interested in the psychological aspects of slavery. As the 19th century came to a close, the case of Magnolia Harrington and Theodore Whitman had gone from being a local scandal to something that was of interest to a wider range of people in academia and society. Researchers examining the psychological effects of slavery on both the enslaved and enslaving populations serve as a complex illustration of how intelligence and strategic thinking could arise even in the most repressive conditions. Magnolia's advanced psychological manipulation was a challenge. Assumptions about the intellectual abilities of enslaved people while also bringing up troubling questions about the hidden forces that may have controlled many similar relationships during the antebellum. South. The last written record of the case was in 1895. Almost 40 years after Theodore Whitman's death, in a short article that appeared in the Journal of Southern History. An anonymous writer who said they knew the events personally wrote an article that said, Magnolia Harrington did live a long time after the Civil War, and had used her intelligence and understanding of people to make a good life for herself in the northern part. This story says that she was still interested in helping former slaves adjust to their new lives, while carefully avoiding anything that might bring attention to her past or show who she really is. The unknown. The author said that Magnolia eventually got married and had kids, using her knowledge of business and education, to become a respected member of Philadelphia's African-American community. It was said that her kids had been told that their mother was a former slave who had saved up for years to buy her freedom, a version of events that was believable because it had enough truth in it and left out the more controversial parts of her. Real history. The article said that Magnolia had purposely let. She wanted to keep the truth about her past hidden because she thought the whole story of how she had manipulated people mentally. Theodore Whitman would not be useful in the new situation of the world after the war. Whether this last account is a true historical record, information, or just more myths and guesses about. We can't figure out what happened to Magnolia based on the evidence we have. The writer, the person who wrote the 1895 article, never said who they were, and no other. There has never been any evidence to back up his claims about Magnolia's later life. The persistence. However, the interest in her fate indicates that her case addressed fundamental inquiries regarding human nature, intelligence, and the ongoing connection between oppression and resistance that persisted. With people watching for a long time after the situation that caused her to be manipulated became a part of history, the psychological strategies that Magnolia utilized against Theodore. It wasn't until well into the 20th century that academic psychology formally recognized and classified Whitman. Century. Contemporary researchers examining her methodologies have observed significant similarities to manipulation strategies that are now understood as forms of psychological warfare, which includes taking advantage of people's grief on purpose, making, artificial dependencies, and the slow breakdown of rational thought through carefully planned emotional stress. The complexity of her approach, especially considering her limited formal education and the social constraints she faced, indicates an innate comprehension of human psychology that few trained professionals of her time could possess, equaled the wider effects of Magnolia's case on how we understand the concealed psychological dynamics of slavery persist in eliciting scholarly interest and talk. Her ability to control Theodore Whitman showed that the power dynamics that were thought to define the institution of slavery were much more complicated and unstable than its supporters had said. The possibility of similar manipulation occurring in other instances without detection indicates that the psychological effects of slavery on slaveholders may have been more profound than previously recognized, making weaknesses that smart and strategic slaves could use to their advantage in the right situations. But the moral complexity of Magnolia's actions makes it easy to understand or judge, even from a modern point of view. Values that clearly say slavery is wrong. She used psychological trauma on Theodore Whitman on purpose, which was bad enough to contribute to his death, which raises tough questions about the moral limits of fighting against oppression. The fact that she had to deal with a lot of collateral damage to get her success. Other enslaved people who had nothing to do with her plan adds to the already complicated case by making it more morally unclear. The case of Magnolia. Harrington ultimately exemplifies the untenable choices. Confronted by individuals ensnared in systems of systemic oppression and dehumanization. Her intelligence and strategic thinking came out, even though the situation was set up to keep them hidden. To stop exactly these kinds of things from happening, showing that people are capable of doing so. Be completely stopped, even in the most strict situations. But her victory was not complete and was morally compromised, attained through methods that cause their own kind of trauma and unfairness, even as they fight. The basic ideas behind the system she wanted to get away from. More today, more than 160 years after Theodore Whitman died in his study at Whitman's Rest, the sound of Magnolia's footsteps has long since faded from the halls of the plantation house that was torn down in 1868. But the questions she asked, the psychological manipulation of her master continues to resonate in our comprehension of human nature. Intelligence and the intricate dynamics between oppression and resistance. Her story is a reminder that even when things are at their worst, the human mind still has the ability to think strategically and psychologically. Warfare, often in ways that make people question what they think they know about it. Think they have complete control over other people, the real truth about Magnolia Harrington, her fate, her reasons, and the full extent of her. We may never fully understand what they can do, but maybe that lack of certainty is itself part of what she left behind, a whisper of intellectual possibility that could never be totally quiet, a show of human intelligence, would always find ways to come out and make itself known, no matter what the social and legal limits meant to keep it in check. In the end, her biggest win may not have been the manipulation of Theodore Whitman himself, but the constant questions her. The story keeps asking questions about the nature of power, intelligence, and the human spirit is strong and will not be completely broken, even when it is legally owned by someone else.